Okay, here we go. We are flowing into week 3, and our themes for this week are going to be all centered around food. Because again, our structure for this course, this journey, is to have high level themes, moving into body, moving into food, and then doing a summary or having the synthesis of all of these things. And so, being that my background and research concerns foods, I thought we would delve into the food aspects of each of the chakras and what they represent. So let's start off with a general quote. And this is something that I had on social media not too long ago. And it is, rather than perceive certain foods as enemies, how might it be if we saw them as teachers, getting us to understand and know our body and emotions better? So that's the place that the flow comes from when it comes to food, that there is an engagement and partnership, much like when we were talking about partnership in week 1, and then partnership and creativity. Now we bring that into the food and eating experience, seeing food as partners, as teachers. And so how do we take a creative viewpoint with food and eating? And one of the aspects that I like is to focus on colors. And some of you know my work a little bit more intimately in the way of knowing me as being less about dietary dogma and more about the art of eating. I've been doing that for some years now with my books, with teaching, with online courses. And what I find is that this is our unifying factor, is really bringing in the whole idea of food is fun. Food is colorful. Food is playful. Food is a rainbow. And so moving into that space of thinking rather than getting caught in the threads of all of the fibers of what we hear out there in society, the tapestry of society, right? And so when I think of flow, we're going to whittle down into each of these individual details. But if you look at the Nourish Your Whole Self card deck and the set that I put together for flow, we have a lot of different themes here. We're not going to delve into each of them, but we will touch upon them in some aspect. And maybe we've already touched upon some of these. And so moving from left and into right, kind of in a clockwise type setting, we will talk about emotional eating. We've already talked about water in week 2 as it relates to our bodies. Cravings, what do cravings represent? What about the color orange? The color orange as it relates to foods. Tropical fruits. If we think about flow and beaches and sunsets and thinking of the fats and oils, the tropical oils, how can we embody some of the energetics of those foods? And that's probably going to be more novel for some of you. Some of you were in the Rainbow Foods and Supplements course, and I touched on the energetics of food a bit. And I'm going to bring that back into our discussion here because to me, food is not just physical. It has energetic, emotional, mental, spiritual properties. And so the energy that I'm speaking to are more or less the symbolic characteristics. The other one that we'll get into in this particular webinar is to talk about fats and oils. And then we have the playfulness of a meal, our senses at a meal. And so I want to take you back into our first week and bring some of those threads of creativity, playfulness, emotions back into now the meal setting. So having fun with food. And so this week, letting ourselves do that just a little bit more than we may normally let ourselves do that with food. And so what does that even mean to have fun with food? I want you to explore that. And maybe you even pause this webinar recording now and you jot down a couple of ideas as to what does it mean for me to have fun with food? Again, I do think, based on my experience, that we need to visualize, we need to have an intention around something for us to really create that experience. At least in a more deliberate way. We'll get there in a more streamlined way if we're able to just have some general ideas. Even if those are starter ideas, they can take us into other places. There's also the aspect of how we eat with the flow. And what I like about the flow is that it's very sensual. It's very focused on the senses. And one of the ways that we get input from our senses is through touch. And this is something that I think that many people override in the food and eating experience, where we don't get as much in the way of touching our food, getting messy, letting things dribble down our chin, or we might eat certain foods with our hands just because of the nature of the food, like I'm thinking tacos, or even like this watermelon slice. But then how do we go beyond the usual and customary and create some creative opportunity to eat with our hands food that isn't normally eaten with the hands alone? So I would like you to explore that. And perhaps that goes even into how you select foods at the farmer's market, at the grocery store, wherever you buy your food. One of my favorite things to do, and I began doing this more later in life as I began to wake up to my relationship with food and eating in this more creative way, is I would start to use my sense of touch in selecting foods. So feeling the smoothness, feeling the energy of food, smelling food before I would purchase it. Because if you think about it, if you walk past a bin of anything, let's just say you walk past a bin of oranges and you want to select an orange, how do you actually make that decision? So kind of having that relationship through your senses, touch, smell. You won't be able to always taste in these settings, but how can you connect your senses in with even the selection of food for your bodies? And maybe once you get them home, feeling out where your body is in relationship to that specific food. So let's talk a little bit about emotions and eating, because this is a hot topic these days. And so emotions and eating, if you look at some of the statistics that are out there, over 75% of overeating is due to emotional reasons. And I do think that part of the failure of any particular dietary approach is that it doesn't recognize a whole person approach along with it. So it's just about the shopping list. It's just about the recipes. And it's not really looking at the individualized response of somebody with their emotional state and a variety of different eating experiences. And so if we think of emotional eating, in other words, when we are eating instead of feeling, or we choose to circumvent or circumnavigate our emotions to eat instead of to express just for the sake of comfort, we move away from that path of flow, right? We start to stuff things down rather than to let things bubble up and express. So one of the aspects of emotional eating that I think is interesting is I've gone into the literature on this pretty extensively and have made presentations and, just got into this a bit more, is that first and foremost, we just have to know what we're feeling. If we know what we're feeling and we can make sense of our emotional states and to actually have a relationship with our emotions, then there's less a chance then we will neglect stuff, stagnate, or just outright ignore them. So that's why I had you in week 1 have this introduction to the emotional log so that you could start to create that dialogue. DI, the exchange between two people, dialogue, discussion. That's so important as it relates to our emotions. And so it starts there, which is why we started there in week 1. And now we're bringing that into full circle, identifying our feelings so that we don't start to stuff them. What's really also interesting is that the more that we can connect to eating foods that are lively, colorful, vibrant, the more that we take on that energy in our everyday lives. So one of the mantras that I have as part of Food and Spirit is, when you eat colorful foods, you live a colorful life. And it's based on research. So this particular article, published in the British Journal of Health and Psychology, this was in 2015, The title of the article caught my eye because it was all about, it started off with, "On Carrots and Curiosity. Eating fruits and vegetables is associated with greater flourishing in daily life." What a beautiful article title. Essentially, they were looking at people, hundreds of young adults, mostly women, who did a very simple diet diary for 13 days in a row. And they also tracked their moods. And they found that these young adults who ate more fruits and vegetables reported higher average eudaimonic well-being, more intense feelings of curiosity, and greater creativity compared with adults who ate less fruits and vegetables. Now, this is not a cause and effect study where you change something to look at its effect. This is an association study where we see what is associated with what as two equal players. And so that's what was found, was that there was an association between curiosity, creativity, and positive affect and fruits and vegetables. So isn't that interesting, right? That we can change our mood potentially by changing our food. This is another study, same journal, different year, 2013. And essentially what they found was that eating fruits and vegetables may promote emotional well-being among healthy young people. Same kind of thing here. So 281 young people for 21 consecutive days in a row. And they found that on days when young adults experience greater positive affect, better mood, that they reported eating more servings of fruits and vegetables, which really makes me think of the very temporal or acute effects of having these foods. It's not like we have to wait a long time in order to see these effects. Meaningful changes in positive affect were observed with the daily consumption of about 7 to 8 servings of fruits or vegetables. So there's kind of this threshold effect. It's not just have a couple of fruits and vegetables, but there is this threshold of 7 to 8, which they found. But I think that anything that we can bring in that's colorful, even if it's 1 or 2 servings of fruits and vegetables, is going to fare better than somebody who has none. So it's not that we have to constantly achieve and strive for this high benchmark, but we move closer into it. So orange foods, we're going to get into all these orange foods. The color code that I've established, the rainbow diet for orange and orange foods, is that of hormone health and reproductive health. A lot of these foods, by the nature of the phytonutrients that they contain, are very protective, especially for fat tissue in the body. So I made a short list here of some of the foods that are orange that we can open up in our week 3 here of our discussion, and some of the different phytonutrients that are associated with orange foods, things like alpha carotene, beta cryptoxanthin, which not many people know about, but it's one of the many carotenoids that seems to have an effect with hormones and perhaps some associations with some reproductive health conditions as well. Bioflavonoids, carotenoids as a huge class, curcuminoids. Usually when we think of turmeric, we think of curcumin, but there's a class of curcuminoids. And again, I think what we have seen in the food and supplement world is that there's some research somewhere that just latches on to one out of many different constituents and studies that, and then that becomes the holy grail for whatever that food can provide. And I do think that we miss the complexity when we do that. Again, the flow is about partnership. It's about seeing the healing of more than one. It's not quite like the root, which is about the tribe, but it's like there's relationship, right? One relationship that we can focus in on is the relationship of one nutrient to another nutrient in food, and how you can quickly throw off something off balance if you don't have it as balanced with something else. One of the other unique qualities that I talk about with the energetics of food in the flow section is that of soluble fiber. So with the root, if you recall, I talked about insoluble fiber, which is the kind of fiber that does not swell in the presence of water. So it's like a broom. It just moves through the gut. Whereas soluble fiber, the reason why it's associated with the flow is because soluble fiber, which comes from all different kinds of fruits and vegetables, we get them from fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, you name it, that the soluble fiber swells in the presence of water and moves things through, adds bulk, adds motility, also allows for the slow release of sweeteners, sugars from foods into the bloodstream. So from the aspect of being diabetic or having metabolic syndrome, soluble fiber can be helpful. So let's dive, that's very high level. Let's go deeper. Let's take a dive into the realm of fats and oils. And as you probably recall, this is what I had my PhD dissertation on, was fats and oils, essential fatty acids. So I'm just going to round out here some aspects of fats and oils that I think are important to acknowledge, and maybe they're not acknowledged enough. First and foremost, I do want to mention fat phobia. I think that for so many years, there's been a shying away from fat because people thought that it made you fat to eat fat. And then we kind of graduated away from that into thinking, oh, weight gain is just about calories. If you have too many calories, you put on more than you expend, you are going to gain weight. And now we know that even that is very reductionistic and simplistic, and there's much more to it, because an 80-calorie brownie has different effects than an 80-calorie apple in the body. But yet, from a calorie perspective, they've been treated equally. So starting with, I would say in the 1990s, it was when I was first going through graduate school where I can remember all of this low-fat stuff happening. So Snackwell's cookies were appearing on the shelves. You had all these different margarine products, which were supposedly better than things like butter or, just outright fat products, because these were modified fats that were supposedly better. They were from oils rather than from hard fats. We have gone around the merry-go-round on fats and oils, and I'm glad that I'm seeing some circling back, but I do also see that, again, we're going into excess. We're going into this societal excess. We've gone from a phobia of fat to now a philia, a love of fat, to the point that now it's like everything is ketogenic. And so with the flow, one of the things that we need to be aware of when it comes to the flow is the harmonization of flow. Because so often what flow wants to take us toward is one side or another, right? It's like a pendulum. It's like a pendulum. And I remember even Jeff Bland saying to me years ago about how, he had been in the nutrition field long enough where he had started to see that if you wait around long enough, things are going to shift to the other side. And so let's take the path of balance, of being in the middle, and seeing that there's a proper time to have fat philia, fat love, and there's a proper time to have fat phobia or fat fear. And so knowing more about dietary fats and oils can give us better guidance from a personalized way to navigate, rather than letting societal imprints and trends sway us and create a tsunami of emotions, right? I mean, this is really the beauty and the bane of information that's out there on nutrition. So, a lot has come out on this whole topic. So the way I see this, is what I just described, that there's a spectrum that's out there where you still have some people following a very low-fat regimen because of the fear of gaining weight or heart disease or whatever has been cultivated out there. And then there's clear on the other side of the saturation of flow of looking at only having fat, being an advocate of whatever dietary approach is really into having lots of fat. And I not negating that could be therapeutic for certain people. It's just, it's when our emotions, this is what I've noticed in nutrition, when our emotions become so tethered and connected to a macronutrient that we can't see out of it. it's almost like that becomes our universe, and we get kind of lost in the whole swirl of that. So fats are needed for a variety of different reasons. And so if we look at just the sheer source of energy that they provide, 9 calories per gram. So they're pretty dense with the ability to give us a lot of staying power. So carbohydrate is 4 grams, protein is 4 grams, 4 calories per gram, similar to carbohydrate. But yeah, fats are 9 calories per gram. They are a part of our membranes, which I talked about before, and how important that is. That fat gives us storage and insulation, which is important. Otherwise, it'd be pretty painful to sit down on bones. So it's good that we've got some storage, that we can withstand temperature extremes because we've got fat. Central nervous system function, that we've got the myelin sheath, which is comprised of fat in order to coat and protect the dendrite or the neuron of various types. Vision, even the eye is so embedded with certain types of fats, the retina, allowing us to take in and absorb light to create an image. Cell signaling. If you start to get into the field of molecular biology, which this is just whittling down physiology to the next level, you start to see that everything is about the composition of a bilayer membrane of the cell and how that shepherds the signal from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And much of that is determined by the membrane. So that whole relay race of communication that happens within a cell is, to a large extent, determined by our dietary fat intake and what we have in our bodies. Healthy skin and nails. This is one of the first things that we're looking at when we do a functional nutrition evaluation, is looking at skin health or nails. Are they brittle? Are they thin? What about even hair? Looking at essential fatty acids throughout the body, which comprise so many different functions and features of our visible body. Then there's also a role in blood pressure, blood clotting, and inflammation. This really dovetails into the eicosanoid cascade, looking at eicosanoids, looking at prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and seeing whether or not we have a balance of certain fats in order to reduce inflammation. Gene expression related to metabolism. This is where I start thinking of PPAR alpha, PPAR gamma, all these different genes, and how gene expression connects into how we are metabolizing fuel, and even gene variants. So there might be certain gene variants which metabolize certain fats better than others, and that's starting to come to light now in the age of personalized nutrigenomics. Behavior, and seeing the connection now between things like anger, aggression, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And that relates to composition, even structural composition of the brain tissue, which is very lipid dense. You know, it's been estimated that our brain is something on the order of 60% lipid. And just very simply, what about the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins and nutrients? So things like vitamins A, D, E, and K, as well as fat-soluble phytonutrients like the carotenoids. So beta-carotene needs fat, alpha-carotene needs fat to be absorbed, and how important that is to have some fat. So let's look at let's zoom out of the physiological properties of fat and the functions that it's playing in the body, and just look at the feel of fat, the energy of fat. Fat is embracing. It solubilizes. It is, even if I'm thinking of in Ayurveda, I think about the constitutional types, and I think of kapha, which is soft and round and yielding in its functional state. It is the wise grandmother. It is the storyteller. It is the philosopher. And so there is this sense of holding space. You know, fat is so good for holding space. It can also help to satisfy us. It has a satisfying property to it if we sink on into it. right? And so when we eat food that contains more fat, we tend to get more satiated. Of course, we know that because of its brain effects, it can play a role in mood and even creating more flow in the body. So in general, when I feel the energy of fat, I feel a wide range of different qualities depending on the type of fat. And I'm talking very big picture without looking at how does fat from palm oil feel and how does butter feel and what are the energetics. And this might even be a time that you want to pause the recording and say, I'm going to write down all the fats that I normally eat and just tap into, on an intuitive level, what do I feel when I reflect on those different fats? And then you can take it one step further to where you apply this and you say, I'm going to have butter and see how my body feels when I have butter. What are the properties that I exhibit? What are my characteristics that I exhibit? And again, this is not like, oh, I got bloated, or this is not physiological. This is more psychological. This is, think about more the symbolism. Like if fat were a person, who would they be? What would they look like? How would they act? And how do we take the energy of that representation, that substance, which has a chemical resonance, into a almost like a personality, an energy resonance? I know many of us are not used to thinking about food in that way, but since we are focused on the flow and looking at things in a more creative way, I want you to try and be in that space of connecting with food in that place of an energetic relationship. And again, it might be a little bit different. So from a visual standpoint, looking at the energetics of fat, going into too little, where we have too little fat in our diet, and the energy of that might take us into feeling stuck, stagnant, rigid. We can't move, we can't flow, we can't excrete, we can't, it's kind of like it brings us down into the root. When we have deficient flow, our energy needs to go either up or down. And usually we're going to go down, right? We're default back to the flow. And so some of these characteristics are very excessive root-like. Whereas if we have excessive flow, taking away some of the energy from our root, what that can also lead to is a little bit too much congestion, too much chaos. We might also feel more weighed down by having too much. It's almost like that point of, rather than satiation, we get into saturation. So oftentimes, and even in traditional Chinese medicine, there's discussion about how either end of the extreme starts to resemble the other. And where we really want to find ourselves is where that point, that Goldilocks point of just right, is for us when it comes to a food, a substance. And one of the issues I always had with the research on dietary fat, and I started to realize this during my PhD when I would go into these studies, is that people don't eat fatty acids, right? They eat fats, they eat types of fats, they eat different fats that they purchase. And then oftentimes fats are woven into a meal. So there is something about having a certain meal that we embed fats into, and then we have some kind of response. So what is that? And every day, our body might be in a different place and different receptive quality to these different types of fats. This is why I keep multiple types of dietary fats and oils in my kitchen, because it's not like one fat is going to do the trick for me over and over again. And I think that when people hear all of the great data on whether it's, maybe extra virgin olive oil as an example, then they start thinking, well, I need to be doing more of that. And then they only do that. And that can be very limiting. It doesn't give us the diversity. Let's go back to the root for a second. Variety, diversity, get out of our ruts. And so we want to be sure that we're doing that with fats and oils. And to continue on with energy, we need to look at the point of origin, because the point of origin, much like when we were in the root and we talk about protein and how the energetics of an animal protein is different than that of a vegetable source protein. It's not that one is better than the other. I don't come from that moralistic view. I come from a more energy view. So an animal-based protein is heavier in the body. It's denser. It's got different amino acids. Whereas a vegetable-based protein has a bit of a different composition. It has different amino acids. Similar to that, if we draw a parallel now back to fat, animal origin types of fats will take on more of the root. It'll be more of a root flow blend because it has the sense of an animal, right? Which is more grounded, more of the earth, more instinctual. So bring that in. What we do need to think about with animal-based fats and oils is very simply the environmental contaminants that are out there and what the animal is subject to. One of the things that I think, and I've just seen this in studies, right, where they test all different kinds of meats, and they find that, the fattier meats are where a lot of these endocrine disruptors hang out. So we just need to be aware of it. Vegetable origin of fats. Well, they may bring us into a lighter feel with that fat. There are going to be more oils, which are squiggly and flowing, than animal-based fats, which will tend to be more saturated and solid and stabilizing. So it just depends on the individual what they need. And I know that, it's kind of a double-edged sword to look at all of the vegetable-based oils. And I'm not just talking oils, but also vegetable-based, food-based fats. So things like nuts and seeds. So it so much depends on the individual, where we're at, what we need. And if we whittle the different types of fats, so we move away from the origin for a second, and then we say, well, gosh, there are so many different personalities of all the different fats. And this is, again, one of the things that I realized when I started to do my research was that we can't just say fat. It's like, we actually need to start going deeper into, are we talking short chain, medium chain fats, long chain fats, because they all have very different properties physiologically in the body, and energetically, they've got different properties. Anything that's short is quick. So 2 carbons, 4 carbons, 6 carbons, this gets burned quickly for energy. Medium chain, 8, 10, 12. So fats have a structure that occurs in couples of carbons. Isn't that nice how the flow is also connected into that? So it's always a count of 2. So that's why you have 8, 10, and 12 carbons for the medium chain fats. Long chain fats, now we get into 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. I mean, it can go up a bit, but usually we tend to think about, at least when we measure them on the GCMS, the gas chromatograph, it's usually up to about 26 carbons is what we have in our bodies. So isn't that kind of neat? I just thought of that now. I hadn't really had that realization that the way the body even cleaves energy from fat is through a unit of 2 carbons, acetyl-CoA, right? And acetyl-CoA moves into cycles of energy. So we get different energy. So butter, which is going to be rich in short chain fats, is going to be different than coconut oil, which is more medium chain fats. There's a different burning of energy. We talk about them in the functional nutrition world and as very good for the gut because they're quick burning fats. And then you have something like the long chain fats, animal-based fats, which are longer, and they don't get absorbed the same way as short and medium chain fats. They are, rather than just being absorbed and perhaps burned by the enterocyte or the intestinal cell, they might actually go directly into the portal circulation to the liver for burning. Versus long chain fats, which are more hydrophobic, will need to go through the lymph. And when it has to go through the lymph, now you've got to make a long journey. The lymph is, again, we talked about the lymph when we spoke about the body. It is the reservoir of a lot of these fatty components. It provides the nice meeting ground for fat-based components, which cannot always hang out in the blood. The blood is more watery. The lymph is more fatty. And so if you've got something really hydrophobic, it's going to have to go through the lymph and then eventually move its way through the liver and into systemic circulation. So that's how it starts to connect to the different organs. So why the war on fats? Let's look at this from a philosophical point of view. You know, let's take this now, the energetics, and zoom up rather than zooming down, and ask ourselves, what's going on that some people fear fat? I think that it's such an interesting inquiry into why there's such a fear of fat in general, like fat in the diet, fat in the body. Why? You know, I want you to explore that rather than me give you my feelings on it. Maybe wax on this. And I'm using that word wax very deliberately, right? Wax, fat. Wax on this a little bit in your journal. Do you fear fat? Do you fear fat on your body? Do you fear fat, maybe losing too much fat? Do you fear eating too much fat? Does eating fat lead to a certain psychological response within you? So that's what this week is about. It's about waking up to our energetic and physiologic connection to a lot of these flow foods and our experience with relating with foods of various types. Why has the ketogenic diet gone gangbusters? Have we gone the other way? What has happened there? I remember in, gosh, it was around 2001 that we got really into high protein. And now it's almost like the pendulum has swung again, and now we're into high fat. Why? What do you think this is on the societal level? I'd like to create a thread around this to get you to be thinking about what that could possibly be about. And why is there a lack of understanding of quality versus quantity? And, you know, people making snap, rash judgments about fat without really having understanding of what all the different fat types involve. And are we changing that? I think many of you are in nutrition, so you might have a different lens, but I'm just wondering about the mainstream population. I still see on containers and packages, you know, low fat being touted as looking like it's the more superior choice. So kind of interesting. So the nutrition physical exam, how do we know just by looking at our bodies whether or not we have adequate fat? Well, one of the ways is to do a bioimpedance analysis to look at the compartmentalization of fat in the body relative to lean body mass. We can also look at the skin. If skin gets flaky, rough, dry, scaly, and you especially see this in animal models where they stop giving them certain fats, and you can see what happens to them. Low essential fatty acids, that these can be measured just through a very simple dry blood spot test. There's one that I like, it's called Omega Quant, but most labs provide this as a measurement now. So you can get more information about the composition of the fats in your body just by looking at the analysis of your blood. Hormone levels. When hormone levels go low, like cholesterol levels, this may also be an indicator. I mean, our body can make cholesterol, so it's not an indicator per se of absorption, but we may be using up a lot of these components in forming cholesterol or in forming sex hormones, which come from cholesterol, which come from our ability to make these fats or even to take them in the diet. So all the different fats, I wanted to bring this up because most people, when they think of a certain fat, let's just take like canola oil, which so many people are like, oh, canola oil. Well, canola oil is not just, we need to look at the complexity. I'm just taking that as an example because it's listed first here. So if we look at canola, which has a bad reputation, and I think that that reputation in part comes from the fact that much of the canola oil that's out there, if it's not organic, is genetically modified, and people are really polarized to that. However, for canola oil that's not genetically modified, if you look at the actual plant it's from, and if it is organically grown, I mean, it's from the cruciferous vegetable family. It's from mustard, rapeseed. And so if we look just at the composition, we can see that this yellow bar, 61% omega-9, it's got quite a nice percentage. If you look at the orange here, perfect for flow, is alpha-linolenic acid, which is an omega-3 fat. It's an essential fat. Most people think of flaxseed oil when they think of getting more plant-based omega-3s, but canola oil can provide a substantial component of omega-3s as well, as much as it can the omega-6, which if we have inflammation in the body, one of the things that we want to look at is the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. So canola is also a little bit high in omega-6 fats. So that's something to consider. But the point of me showing you this is not to talk about canola oil. It's really actually just to show you that every fat, no matter what, is comprised of many different personalities of fatty acids. I mean, even down to coconut oil. Many people think, oh, it's just a saturated fat. Well, it is primarily saturated fat. It's 91% saturated fat, but 7% of that is omega-9 or unsaturated fat, and 2% on average is linoleic acid and omega-6 unsaturated fat. So every fat and oil is comprised of a variety of different fatty acids. And if we look a little bit closer at those fatty acids, they will either be saturated, which if you look at the saturated, it's just all in a line here, which makes them nice to stack. Saturated fat can stack in, they're very dense, and so you can get a lot of them inside a cell membrane. Whereas unsaturated fats have a little kink in them because, as you can see here by the highlight in red, there's a double bond between the carbons, and that leads to a different configuration, so it kind of bends. So you can imagine that if you have an unsaturated fat with just one double bond, which would be like oleic acid, which is found in olive oil, that would be very different in a cell membrane than something like saturated fat, which let's just take from lard, from animals, which would stack very differently in a cell membrane. And the ability to have it in the stacking configuration versus a flowing configuration can change the cell signaling of a cell. So just think about this in terms of the properties. What I really like about the fats as a macronutrient is that you can get a bit of the root through saturated fat. I'm almost thinking energetically that our society, because of its longing for the root, stability, trust, having an anchoring, feeling safe, that we have gone over to a lot of these saturated fats. The unsaturated fats are more of the fluid flowing fats. And again, will create a different dynamic physiologically and also has a very different energetic kind of connotation. So this is from one of my books, one of the diagrams that I made a long time ago. A healthy membrane has a mixture of these kinds of fats. It has some saturated, it has mono, it has poly, has all different kinds. It's kind of like people, right? It's like a society is best served when it has a diverse blend of people. Whereas when we start to get too many, as we see in the second line here, too many rigid saturated fats, that's going to lead to that will have less flow, less dynamism. And if we have too much flow, that's a little bit chaotic. Then it's like, well, things may not stay in the cell to the level that we actually require them inside the cell. And so the takeaway here, literally and symbolically, is that we need a healthy mix. Just like amino acids, back to the root and protein. We need that same blend. And if you look up close inside the cellular matrix, and I'm so intrigued with the cell membrane. The cell membrane dynamics. Bruce Lipton, Joyce Hawkes, and others, if you look at their lineage as scientists, they started working on the cell and even the membrane dynamics, and then they moved into spiritual disciplines. And I think that there is something about the cell membrane that is very spiritual. There's like a little universe going on here of the boundary, the flow, the flux. What do we let in the cell? What comes out of the cell? What is the dance of internal, external, just even within our own body through the conduit of a cell membrane? And we are always modifying that boundary, that membrane, through proteins and fats. And you can see these big red globular proteins. You can see the little tiny fats, which are the squiggly components that I showed you a zoomed in view of. So in general, now let's transition into, let's go into the gut a bit. And keep in mind that the flow involves primarily the large intestine, where we tend to find a number of different microorganisms. You find them in the small intestine as well, in certain parts. But essentially, what I have seen in the literature is that when, let's focus on the cartoon here. Let me just explain this so that you're not overwhelmed. If we start on the left side and be thinking about a fiber-rich diet, lots of fiber in the diet, lots of soluble fiber, yay, flow. What happens is that depending on the gut microorganisms we have, the gut microbiota will metabolize these fibers into small, shorter chain fibers that have self-signaling effects, things like acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And there is even some use of giving certain ones of these as a supplement, like butyrate, which is rich in butter. So C2, C4, or actually C3, this is propionate, I believe, has 3 carbons, and butyrate has 4. Acetate and butyrate are the primary ones that do get talked about. But when we produce more of these short chain fats, we get some cell signaling effects that go from the gut lumen, so all the activity in the within the expanse of the gut with the bacteria, and then we start seeing the effects cross over into our systemic circulation. So, and we can see that with a fiber deficient diet, we can also see some changes here with the gut is not metabolizing fiber, so we don't get the benefits of these short chain fats. By the way, we do have odd numbered fatty acids. They are just not as common in nature. Like, for example, one of the things I used to do when I used to analyze fatty acids was we used C17 or heptadecanoic acid as an internal standard, because it doesn't usually occur very often and it's a very low peak. I mean, they do occur to some degree, but not to the level that a lot of these even number fatty acids do occur. So without fiber and in the presence of dysbiosis or lots of unhealthy bacteria, we don't get the protective effects of these short chain fats, and we can start to see inflammation. That's the takeaway. So fatty acids can be grouped into essential fatty acids and non-essential fatty acids. And what the essential fatty acids denotes is that they're essential. So if we don't eat them in the diet, we will in some way exhibit a deficiency. So the non-essentials are the ones that our body makes. We make saturated fat. We make the type of fat that's in olive oil. We make monounsaturated fat like oleic acid. So there's nothing special about olive oil in terms of its oil. What I think is special about olive oil is all the things that come along for the ride with this lipophilic fat blend, right? Like the olive polyphenols. Polyunsaturated fats, we can make certain of them that don't belong to the omega-6 and omega-3 series. And trans fat are definitely non-essential. We do not want trans fats in our food because, you know, they're usually made through the process of hydrogenation, which is a human-made process to encourage longer shelf life in processed foods. And our body doesn't really know what to do with these. So they usually perturb our body. Just to refresh your memory as to the essential fatty acid cascade, and I'm not going to go into this too much, but if you just look at it big and broad and you say, okay, on the left we have omega-6, on the right we have omega-3. And I use color here to teach the differences. So on the left, the omega-6, it's yellow. There are some healthful properties. It's kind of a yield. But if we have too much of the omega-6, it can route into certain fats that can lead to inflammation when they're in excess. The omega-3 on the other side, you can see, is cooling blue. It's blue, it's more anti-inflammatory. Many of these fats move into prostaglandins that are anti-inflammatory. So it's all about the balance of these two families. And if you're born as an omega-3 fat, you will never be an omega-6. These two families do not cross over. So once an omega-6 fat, always an omega-6 fat. Once an omega-3 fat, always an omega-3 fat. So we need to keep that in mind, that there is no metabolism amongst these two families. They stay very separate in the body. So when we have an imbalance of these two, oftentimes we can see it in the body. And ideally, we don't want to let it get to this point. There are certain markers in blood we can look at before we start to exhibit, whether it's behavioral issues, skin issues, cracked skin, poor wound healing, allergies can be related to fatty acid imbalance. It's almost like, again, I've mentioned this before, but if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In a similar way, if you have any symptom, because fats are ubiquitous and flowing throughout our bodies, what you can see is that if you have an imbalance, you can almost affect just about any system. So liquid oils, all the different kinds. I made a short list here, and I'd like you to add to this list in case I've left anything out. There are so many different ones to choose from. I think that, again, one of the things that I see with people is that they don't have enough variety in their dietary oils and fats. And some of these are highly processed. They're not so healthy. They're in plastic containers, which you never want with a fat. And so you want definitely a darkened glass bottle, like a green or black bottle, so that heat, light, and oxygen can't break these down. Here are some food sources of omega-9. Now, these are non-essential fats, non-essential. So a lot of nuts and seeds, as I mentioned, olive oil. Avocados are also really rich in omega-9 fats. But again, it's we don't need that fat. Our body can make that fat. So I always think, well, what else are we getting from avocado oil? Tropical fats like coconut oil. I think that let's just reflect on this for a second. There's such a craze, at least as far as I can see, and depending on where you live, this may differ, but there is a craze on coconut. There is. Why is that? Are we needing a little bit more stabilizing flow? Do we need a little bit more relaxation? Do we need a little bit more of the energetics of the tropics and what that embodies? I'd like you to reflect on that. Why this shift over to coconut? I mean, if you think of a coconut, round, loving, it's almost like, how can anybody have any kind of malicious intent towards coconut? It's just so soft and yummy, and there's something really beautiful about coconuts, right? But I do think that some people are taking them to excess. They're doing coconut everything, and I am seeing that people are displaying greater sensitivities and tolerances and even allergy with all this coconut that they're doing. I mean, coconut is a tree nut, right? So for people that already have a sensitivity to nuts and seeds, this might ultimately fall into that category for them if they don't get the variety. Variety, again, is so key. So saturated fat, I'm definitely not against saturated fat, even though our bodies can make it. It's all about what comes along for the ride with that saturated fat, right? What are we getting it from, and what is it bringing with it is what I think. What's flowing together with the fat? What's partnering together with that fat and coming into our bodies and creating some type of an effect? All right, on that note, let's move into nuts and seeds. And if you have any other questions about fats and oils, I am happy to discuss them. Let's get a thread going on our Facebook page. I really just did kind of a tippy top of the iceberg on fats and oils. There's a lot there, of course. So nuts and seeds. I also think about the anatomical connection to nuts and seeds if we think of our physiology, right? Seeds, kind of the seeds of reproduction. So to think about how the beauty of seeds and nuts is that oftentimes they contain very complex mixtures that are suitable for growth. They're very complete foods in that way. They can also be difficult to digest because they could have hard shells or hard bran coats. So there's also that. Lots of different choices, and perhaps this is a week that you explore some of the different nuts and seeds that you have at home. I know I move amongst the nuts and seeds with some flow because I don't want to develop any kind of sensitivity, and I know that my body can, it doesn't break down nuts and seeds as well, so sometimes I have to take digestive enzymes, or sometimes I have to take some kind of stomach acid support in order to help me with nuts and seeds, but I like to cycle through them. Usually if I'm traveling, I like to bring Brazil nuts, good source of selenium, very satiating, and different ones of these. I'm noticing that I didn't even put cashews here. Certain ones of these are going to be a little higher fat than others, like cashews, macadamia nuts are pretty high fat. Pine nuts are pretty high fat compared to some of the others, okay? And the way that you access the fat, at least from the seeds, is by grinding it up. So whenever I see marketing on like a cereal box for get your omega-3s, this is a flaxseed cereal, but the flax seeds aren't ground up, so you don't have access to the fat in your digestive tract. Mostly these are just going to run right through you, right? So you're not actually getting omega-3s unless you crack these seeds open, or nuts, that you digest them well. So the energetics, reproductive foods, right? Nuts in general have high fat and protein content, which contributes to their high energy density. They're good, and in the way that they're a very complete food. And so for vegans and vegetarians, many times this is their root and flow protein fat source. And so in nut intake, there are a number of studies on eating nuts, a variety of nuts, mixed nuts, together with better nutrient adequacy and higher diet quality. Now, for other people, they can be a little bit too rich and they can't stop eating the nuts. I've also seen that clinically too. So maybe they need more fats. Consumers of tree nuts have more favorable intakes of vitamins A and C, folate, which is vitamin B9, calcium, iron, magnesium, and zinc. It's a really good source of minerals. So I see nuts and seeds as a root flow food. It's a root chakra, sacral chakra, blended food. This is where the two come together and dance. So very complete, very nourishing, very stabilizing, yet very flowing. Orange foods. Let's talk about those for a second. And I called out some of the different orange food-based phytochemicals like beta-carotene, which most people think of when they think of carrots, but I also think of bioflavonoids. And these different phytonutrients, even though I'm calling them out in singular fashion, they actually work best as a team. So the carotenoids, which I had the pleasure of studying during my 3-year graduate study at the University of Illinois with Dr. Phyllis Bowen and Dr. Maria Sapountzakis. I'd like to give credit to them. I studied carotenoids for 3 years. So this has been, perhaps this is in part what turned me on to colors and the healing property of colors. And if you start to look at carotenoids as a class, we're talking about 700 different compounds in nature. Not all of them are orange. Some are red, some are yellow, some are different shades, some can be colorless. So, but mostly they have some pigment quality to them. So what was really interesting about this particular study is because I have pegged orange colored foods as having some connection to reproductive health or the sacral chakra, and I talk about that in the Rainbow Diet book and in Whole Detox a bit, started to look into the science as to, well, what happens if you eat these orange foods, orange plant foods specifically. There was this particular study, which was published in a fertility journal in 2016 with over 1,000 premenopausal women, and they were followed for a pretty long time. They were followed for over 12 years. That was the average amount. And what these researchers found was that both beta-cryptozanthin, which is one of the carotenoids found in orange foods, and fruit intake was associated with a significant delay in the onset of natural menopause. Wow. If we can push menopause out a little bit, wouldn't that be a good thing? We hang on to our vitality. We keep our sense of robustness and hormone balance. So what the authors came to, and I thought that this was a very important quote and extraction from what their data showed, was that a diet containing about 400 micrograms of beta-cryptozanthin per day from fruits had the significant potential to delay the decline of the ovaries by 1.3 years. So where do you find beta-cryptozanthin? You find it in round orange fruits, typically mandarins, oranges, and peaches. Wild-caught salmon, I think of orange. I'm going to add this. Usually I just talk about orange plant foods, especially when I talk about eating the rainbow. But here, and let's just portal back into the root, red meat. So that would be, from whether cows or, just red meat in general, like game meats. But now we have, if we are talking about animal foods that are orange, we think of wild-caught salmon, which is kind of that pinkish orangish color. And you have to be careful because sometimes dyes are added to make it even more appealing and appeasing. Even butter. Most butter has had some carotenoid added to it to make it more yellow because we have a color association with certain foods now. So that can happen with salmon. Tropical fruits, which can be orange in color. So when I think of the papaya, a story actually comes to mind. I'm thinking of a workshop that I gave some years ago when I was teaching yoga more regularly. And I asked these ladies to talk about a food that represented who they were. And there was one woman in the group who said, I'm a papaya. I am lush, I'm luscious, and I'm full of seeds and creative fertility. She was just really into her feminine self. And I began to think about it like, wow, what a great analogy for the reproductive tract, or specifically the uterus. It's even shaped like a uterus. And here it is holding all of these seeds, right? Very fertile. And papaya has a number of beautiful studies on it. It's actually very rich in a number of different carotenoids that are bioavailable. It contains digestive enzymes like papain. Papain helps us to break down protein. I mean, it's just, it fuels a lot here. The other side of the spectrum is it does contain, well, it's a latex fruit. And so for some people that have issues with latex allergy, this might be a fruit to reduce the amount of or to refrain from eating in case there are some kinds of different intolerances or an allergic effect. But in general, tropical fruits, soft, flowing, sweet, and just full of just so many healthful properties. And so I think of all the different tropical fruits that are out there, whether passion fruit, and I know that in this section we're talking about orange fruits, foods and fruits in general, but think about kind of the landscape of tropical fruits. And for some of us, we don't live in a tropical sphere, so it's not necessarily consistent with perhaps our physiological need to have tropical fruits. And we don't have to. But when they're in season, maybe to let yourself have a little bit of these seeded, juicy, luscious fruits and see how you feel when you eat them. So here's a short list of tropical fruits. So mangoes, pineapple, papaya, oranges, kiwi, figs, coconut, the energy of the tropics. Think of what that means for you. Delight, joy, relaxation. Think of the feeling you get when you're on a beach and there's not much that you need to do. You're going to go with the flow. So a lot of these, and if we think of where food is grown, that it takes on the element and the energy of that land or sea, wherever it is. So we are getting the energy of that landscape when we take in these foods. I did mention the latex fruit reactions. mango, coconut. These are some of the ones that you might want to be thinking about if you do have. So again, not all of these foods are going to be good for everybody at all times, and we need to properly assess that. Citrus, like oranges, are high in beta-cryptozanthin, and beta-cryptozanthin usually doesn't get talked about as one of the primary healing carotenoids, but there is more and more literature coming out suggesting that might be a good thing. And I think, I mean, just even look at an orange, it looks very feminine. You know, this is almost like the doctrine of signatures, looking at food, what it looks like, and we can't always make that. The reason why I've never really talked so much about that is because I just don't feel like there's a lot of consistency. There are certain threads. So surely here with oranges, round, you know, multi-layered, it's very feminine, right? Juicy fruits, peaches, you know, foods that are flowing and high in water content are going to help feed our flow. And for some of you, this is summertime, so it's a perfect time of year to get some of these luscious, juicy, messy kind of fruits that I always think I'm better have a napkin if I'm eating with that. But maybe just let yourself get messy with it when you're eating it, right? And if you're not living in summer right now and you're living more in the southern hemisphere where it might be winter and fall, you might want to be thinking about some of the starchy, high soluble fiber fruits and vegetables that would coincide with the color orange, like pumpkin seeds, pumpkin by itself, so rich in carotenoids. So that might be another way to get your dose of orange. Making different creative medleys that contain orange foods, whether it's yams or orange bell pepper, and bringing in whatever your creativity would like to create there. Circular fruits. So I didn't talk about this as much when we were in the root section talking about squares, but I have shapes for each of the chakras. So for the root, it's square. It's like a house. And I did mention that briefly, but just not in conjunction with food. For the flow or the sacral chakra, we think of the circle. It's again, it goes round, no hard edges. It moves with the flow. So things that are circular fruits like the citrus that we've been speaking to. So maybe key into shapes this week, key into the circular shape of foods, the roundness, the spherical nature of food, and how that feels when you hold it compared to a food that is not that shape. What does it feel like? Carotenoids, as I've been speaking to, if you do a very simple intake of color this week. Now, the thing with carotenoids, again, they're not just orange. They are red, like lycopene is a red-colored carotenoid. I think of lutein, which is a yellow-colored carotenoid. But there is this expanse of orange. So to look at your carotenoid intake, at least of the orange-colored carotenoids, through what you're eating this week, and maybe do just a very simple color tabulation of orange foods. And when you go shopping this week, I'm about to go grocery shopping right after I finish this webinar, actually. And so this is all going to be top of mind. This is how I work. You know, Sunday, get ready for my week. What is my theme? What am I going to focus on? I look at my week. What is my intention? I pick a card. I picked a card today, and it was creativity. And I was like, yes, that is so flow. Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that. So let's look at our food. What's coming out through our food? Are we examining not just the fruits and carotenoids, but maybe exploring carrots? And it doesn't mean that you just have to have the orange carrots. Maybe this is where you have a little fun and you get different colored carrots, orange roots, as I was speaking to, kind of the fleshy, the vegetable side of this equation. Here's a picture from a farmer's market that I went to some years ago. I just thought it was so cute. It was so flow. It's like double flow. It's this caressing, these two carrots coming together in this embrace, and they're orange. What about orange herbs and spices? Things like turmeric. Well, mainly I think of turmeric, right? I mean, that's one of the major orange herbs, but there can be others. Like even if you want to make tea from calendula flowers, So many different aspects of when we were in the root. One thing that came to mind was rooibos, red, all things red. But how can we bring in now orange colored flowers, spices and roots, and incorporate that into our intake, what we're taking in? Maybe make an orange smoothie of any particular composition that your flow wants to go and run with. And maybe to check out some foods that you don't normally have. This is where your curiosity can move into the creative flow, right? Like a persimmon. I know that where I live, persimmons are not, usually they're not, they're like one of my favorite fruits. I absolutely love the smoothness, the beauty of a persimmon. I love how they taste. They're a little bit stone-like, or they have that grainy sensation. They leave kind of a weird taste in my mouth when I'm done, but they're just so beautiful and fleshy. And so it's kind of like, what are some fruits that you haven't had in a while, but you enjoy and they evoke pleasure? And maybe they're a little bit more expensive. So, you see it as a treat. Like a persimmon is really expensive where I live because they're out of the norm. And if you say, well, Deanna, I only eat what's in season, then, maybe that's for you. I like to let my flow go sometimes and eat things that are even out of season. So I'm not wedded to any particular paradigm of like, no, I can only eat this now. It just doesn't work for my root. I like a little bit more flow. I'm probably a more flowy root person. But you have to assess that for yourself, what feels right, okay? So here's what we're going to do this week. And I've given you some ideas as I went through the webinar material so far. So last week we focused on water. This week, as part of our focus on food, I'd like you to focus on dietary fats and oils and to pay special attention to how your body feels when you eat dietary fats and oils. Does it change based on your hunger, your satiety, your cravings? Are there certain fats that evoke more stabilization, like you feel a sense of heaviness, than others? So here are some questions for you to observe. How do fats and oils feel in my body after I eat them? Which fats and oils do I crave? I think that's really important to note. What role do fats and oils play in my diet? Do I eat many of them or very little? Do you have them with every meal, or do you just have them maybe once a day? Do I have certain feelings about fats and oils, whether being drawn to them, such as in following a ketogenic diet, or avoiding them, like might be done in a low-fat diet? Just examine and explore your feelings around fats and oils. And you might even want to do a little bit of you can do it in the present moment. You can also do it as part of like your lineage with eating. Because I know at a certain point, I was fat phobic. When I was in the 90s, when I was going through grad school and really exploring fats, I started to think, are fats really bad? Like, do I really need to withdraw from having them? So there have been times when I haven't always thought that they were a good thing. So maybe exploring your path with fats. Where have you been and where are you now? Here are some activities, and obviously you don't have to do all of them. Pick what resonates with you. And what I say here is if you just want to pick one out of the three. So number one, do an inventory of the fats and oils you eat and that are in your kitchen. Make a list and share it on our Facebook page if you'd like, and I'll do a bit of that. Buy or use a dietary fat or oil that you haven't been accustomed to using. Maybe try out something new. I try to do that every once in a while, like rice bran oil. I don't always have that, so sometimes I treat myself to buying a nice, good rice bran oil. Explore its nutrients and how you can use it in your eating and meals. Maybe try non-traditional uses of these oils. Feel free to share with your partner or on our Facebook group page. And then set in a 2-hour artist date with yourself this week. Involve food and eating. Make up a food game. Do something creative with food. Make a creative meal. Share with your partner and journal on the experience. I do have just a few things for you if you wanted to read or listen. Ann-Louise Gittleman, I did a podcast with her some time ago on bile and fats. I think that was just last year. She's really big into the fat flush plant. She's got her whole thing, but I just wanted to talk with her about bile, because bile is required for fat absorption. So what does she think about that? And then I do have a a blog that we put together on eating a high-fat diet, what it involves and what you need to be thinking about there. So some of the science, if you're wanting to get into that. As far as journaling, if you're doing more of a journal flow through this whole journey together, you might want to keep a log of your emotions and your food intake for at least 3 days. Have one column for your foods and then the other for emotions, and see if you can start to make patterns. Do you notice differences in how you feel after you eat certain foods? And what are certain foods that you're attracted to when you feel certain emotions? You know, use yourself as an experiment. See what patterns emerge. And then with your partner, if you are doing the partnering activities, which I hope you are, being that we're in flow, for an hour, schedule an hour this week and just take turns discussing what you noticed about your foods and your food intake and your emotions. Or you can talk about any aspect of flow. I just wanted to give you a general topic in case you were looking for something specific to discuss. Okay, we're going to stop there. Enjoy this week of the flow, week 3, and all that it holds and brings forward for you. I'm sure it'll be very, it'll be creative. All right, everybody, take care. Have a great week.